for minorities, women, disabled individuals, out of school youth, and ex-offenders, among others. Access to childcare, transportation, food, and housing often prevent these individuals from enrolling in education or even getting a job. We continue to see signs that an economic recovery may not mean everyone will recover equitably. The American Jobs Plan calls for $12 billion to be targeted towards building equity, in labor markets. We have begun work like this in California as the bipartisan Breaking Barriers initiative provides $15 million to partnerships between community-based organizations and workforce boards serving vulnerable populations like ex-offenders. The initiative focuses on three outcomes: enrollment into post-secondary vocational education, enrollment into apprenticeship programs, or placement into a job that has a career path to self-sufficiency. Workforce boards are well positioned to deliver these services at wider scale with the funding proposed. In California, the higher training initiative is $25 million demonstration project designed to model sector-based strategies around the state, ranging from transportation to healthcare to hospitality. The HRTP model exemplifies the focus on industry partnerships that deliver equity, sustainability, and job quality. The American Jobs Plan proposes 48 billion to build the capacity of the workforce development system. One of the key areas for this effort is registered apprenticeship, a proven earn and learn model. Workforce boards could become more active intermediaries in registered apprenticeship and increase participation from non-traditional industries. Costs for curriculum development, training for wage subsidies, and data collection validation should be allowed and supported through this legislation. Job creation strategies like
structural inequities in public school facilities. The success of our efforts in the District of Columbia Public Schools led to the expansion of this work in other cities, states, and the federal government. Deficiencies in our nation's public school facilities have been well known for decades. We know that lead paint, asbestos, PCBs are harmful, that all schools must be ADA compliant, that schools in severe weather zones must be resilient, that schools must be built to educate a modern workforce, and that antiquated wealth and high-needs school districts, but without mandating specific state programs on how to allocate funds. Russell gives states the capacity to assist districts, capacity for rural districts that have built or modernized the school in over a generation, and capacity for urban districts that are overwhelmed by the capacity building that RASA would support at the state level will help distribute
microphone is shared. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Coordinator, to begin the question. This hearing more timely, partly because obviously we have a president who is known to be really serious about doing more than just an manufacturer in the world. That's a project labor agreement incorporating the building trades associations, electric cars. I mean, the list goes on and on. So, Mr. Landner, I guess, you know, I would let just, you talked about how the workforce boards need to sort of, you know, take on a new level, if not new task in terms of being the interface with apprenticeship programs. Can you again just
For millions of American workers and for turning profits for business. And I would just say this last thing. You know, in America's job plan, we can fund costs for curriculum development, training, wage subsidies for these hard-to-serve populations, data collection and validation to make sure we're accountable. And this is really critical to our nation's.
Thank you, Dr. McCluskey. I'm deeply concerned with employers requiring a college degree for work that does not require that level of education because it acts as another hurdle preventing people from climbing the socioeconomic ladder. Why might credential inflation be partially the fault of the federal government? And would the Democrats' proposal for, quote, free, end quote, college exacerbate this phenomenon? What can Congress do or stop doing to encourage more skill-based hiring?
Yeah, if we look historically, you can sort of see where several federal laws greatly increased aid that went to students, and that led to massive additional consumption of higher education, which of course was the intention, but that had huge unintended consequences, which you had more and more people attaining something called a degree. But the degree, as the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, the PAC tests have shown, is that average degree keeps losing more and more as time has gone on of the skills and knowledge that it represents. And what's made that even tougher is that increasingly it enables employers to ask for a degree when people come for a job, not because that degree signifies that you have specific skills and knowledge, but it's becoming more and more a signal that if you don't have that degree, well, maybe there is something that's not quite right with you. And so we've made it sort of a floor instead of a meaningful signal of things that you can do and that you know because you have received an education.
Thank you. Mr. Riedel, Mr. Riedel, you cover the daunting federal budget outlook in your testimony. In your written statement, you called doubling or tripling the national debt, quote, extraordinarily reckless, unquote. What would the real world consequences be to the economy of doubling or tripling the national debt?
Thank you. The numbers are scary. According to the Congressional Budget Office, doubling the national debt would reduce the GNP by $6,000 per person relative than if we don't double the debt. $6,000 per person lower GNP by the end of 30 years per person. So a family of four, that's $24,000 a year less income because there's less investment, less productivity, less growth, and more of the returns go to the international investors who are purchasing our debt. There's also the interest costs. You know, the CBO baseline assumes that in 30 years, just under the baseline, half of your taxes go to interest on the debt. And if we go up to 250 or 300% of GDP, like if interest rates rise or the president's plan is implemented, 2/3 of all of your taxes will go towards interest on the debt in 30 years. And the problem, of course, is you don't feel this while it's building. It's like the termites in the foundation. And then when the debt crisis hits and interest rates are up and we have to raise taxes, it's too late to pull it back very easily. You have to double taxes, slash spending, or print money. Better to avoid the problem in the first place.
Absolutely. And I want to point out, Mr. Chairman, that Mr. Lanter talks about the apprenticeship programs. And as you know, you have said before, we have a 43% graduation rate for apprenticeship programs. And you've called it the gold standard. Others have called it the gold standard. I hardly think we hold up any institutions with a 43% apprenticeship, with a 43% graduation rate as a gold standard. Pushing more people into apprenticeships is not the way to go, as controlled by if they're controlled by the unions. I was talking about registered apprenticeships, so we don't need to be doing that. Thank you very much to our witnesses again, and I yield back.
Thank you. Our next member for recognition is a gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses also for joining us and for sharing their opinion, their comments on this hearing. I want to take special, Mr. Chairman, I'll be bouncing between our hearing and another committee where we're having a 5-hour markup, but I'd be remiss if I don't thank Mr. Mitsui and his community college community, and of course, the people of Oregon for hosting Marianas residents who relocated to attend school in Oregon and other parts of the mainland. And some, like my own daughter, has decided to become full-time residents of Portland. Ms. Fajardo, I want to thank you for your resounding support of RASA And so I'm going to follow up with a question. According to the GAO, 55% of school districts rely on local revenue as their primary source of funding for school infrastructure. Can you describe the unique challenges that high poverty schools and districts face in financing school construction projects, and how does this perpetuate inequity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that these poor districts have been wrestling with, because if you don't have high property value, if you don't have sales tax revenue, if you don't have any other form of public revenue to borrow against, you can't actually do major projects in your schools. So part of what happens to these districts is, rather than having $1 million to replace a roof, they keep patching,
Right.
but then eventually it gets so bad that it's a problem. So they really end up spending more on the maintenance side, disinvesting on the capital side, but they have little choice. And just one other point on that, even in states where there is a state role to help fund, like in Massachusetts or in Georgia, for example, the state will only do so much. And so sometimes the poorest districts can't even raise their 10% in order to get their state matches. So it's very difficult for these low wealth districts.
Thank you very much. Mr. Malik, research suggests that high quality early care and education, including high quality preschool, can be a key tool in reducing achievement gaps. I was just in a conversation with committee staff earlier before this hearing primarily about early care and education. So could you please tell us, what does research show about the emergence of racial and income achievement gaps? When during development do these gaps emerge and grow wider between children?
Yes, thank you for that question. The fact is, as children enter the educational system in kindergarten, there are already well-documented gaps in their educational experience that by that point send them on trajectories towards even wider achievement gaps. There have been numerous studies that show investments in early childhood education don't just have those educational benefits, but they have provide a stability to families that lowers stress, that has a kind of cumulative benefit, that has not just those early educational benefits for children, but that stability really does produce greater long-term outcomes and the kind of safety and security that young children need economically and within the family.
Okay, so does the current childcare system which we have, in which access to quality care is largely predicated on parental income, lend itself to narrowing or closing achievement gaps? And why would it be important that all children, regardless of race or income, have access to high quality childcare?
Yeah, right now we know that childcare deserts disproportionately impact Hispanic Latino communities.
Unlike my district in the islands, the territories.
And very, very much so there. There's also just this market-based reality for early childhood education means that children in families with the highest incomes are 4 times as likely to be going to a licensed childcare program than children in the lowest income quintile. So right now we have just vast inequalities that we need to solve for.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, I think is next. Mr. Grothman.
Hi, a couple of questions. First of all, I kind of want to reiterate what the chairman said. I'm a little bit disappointed. We have so many people from the education background here looking for the federal government to be very involved. And of course, it's unconstitutional. And one of the reasons why our country is so in debt right now is people don't study the Constitution. They think the federal government should take care of everything. So I'm disappointed that so many people in the field of education feel that way. But I'm going to lead off with Mr. Brian Rydell. Brian, I know there's a lot in here for preschool.
Yeah.
I know the Manhattan Institute has done studies on that. I'm sorry. Did someone say something? I wondered if you could comment on the idea of sending children to preschool. Is it successful, or is in some cases it's even counterproductive?
It's tough for me to comment specifically on research that would have been done by my colleagues. I did not do the preschool. I know in terms of Head Start, there have been studies that have not shown that Head Start is as successful as some would like. There have been studies that have shown, I believe, by the Department of HHS, that some of the effects of programs like Head Start end up being more short-term rather than long-term, and that we need to find more creative and interesting ways to help younger children.
I believe you'll find, I'm sorry you didn't read it, but I believe you'll find that preschool can even be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And frequently it's better for children to be with their parents. I know a lot of people are hostile to parents, spending a lot of time with their children, becoming more going to be hostile. But I think some of these programs not only are not helpful, but are even counterproductive. But we'll go to Dr. McCluskey then. We talk about more money for four-year degrees. Could you comment on, say, the number of people in four-year institutions today? And I certainly in my district, again and again, run into people who feel they've been ripped off. They feel that they have a big college debt, or that they spent 4 or 5 years of their life getting a four-year degree, and it didn't get them a job other than a job they would have been qualified for when they were 16 years old anyway. Could you comment on what you think would be an ideal number of people, percent of our population involved in a four-year degree program, as opposed to what currently are there today?
I am sort of hesitant to pick an ideal percentage because I don't know all the different needs of different people. And I think part of the problem we've had is the federal government said, well, we're going to put our thumb on the scale to get people to consume four-year degrees. And what I can say is the data clearly shows we have too many four-year degrees. Data from the Fed shows that about a third of people with a bachelor's degree for their career are in jobs that do not require that credential. So you may say, well, we should reduce the percentage of people with a degree by a third. The other problem we have, though, because all of this is dynamic, is that the more we subsidize people going to college, the more we have jobs that call for degrees. So we would say, well, these people are not underemployed right now because this job now calls for a degree, but it may not have before. And so it's hard to peg a right percentage. The way we find out what's right is it's from the bottom up, people paying for education themselves or with money they get voluntarily from others, because that's what focuses us on what do we need, how much are we willing to pay for it, what do we get along with it. Maybe we don't need the water parks and lazy rivers we see in universities. So I think the thing we can say most clearly is probably about a third of people with certainty got bachelor's degrees and are not using them right now.
So you feel, and I'm just saying, because there are so many good jobs out there that don't require, particularly skilled jobs that don't require bachelor degrees, it would be a mistake, not only a mistake because the federal government is spending money they shouldn't have to spend, but for individuals spending time going to school, it would be better off either training or getting a very well-compensated job in construction field and manufacturing field, what have you. You feel that's true?
Yes, I think a lot of that change needs to happen at the K through 12 level, where we have very little school choice and we need a lot more. So people who don't want to be in that go to the four-year school track can start to seek out apprenticeships and other sort of education earlier than that. But I certainly think if you look at the history of degrees in this country, we have massively overproduced them and driven the price higher because it's all sort of fueled by subsidies that mainly come from the federal government.
I think my time is about up, but we'll show here to other witness, Max Eden, the drawbacks of universal pre-K. and I would suggest it for everybody on the committee to read, because not only is it sometimes not helpful, it's counterproductive. And I know, people don't like, going back, the old traditional family. I'm very hostile right now, but it's something everybody should familiarize themselves with before we put any more federal money into pre-K. Thank you very much. I think that's all my time.
Did the gentleman from Wisconsin offer that for the record?
Sure, we'll put it in there for the record. Absolutely.
No problem. Without objection, I entered into the record. Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The next witness is the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just let me, before I start asking my questions, I just want to give a thumbs up for Head Start. And that's where I started my educational career, and also universal pre-K. I don't know what kind of studies show that universal pre-K does not close the achievement gap between African-American children, children of color, and white children. So when we begin to talk about a once in a generation American Families Plan, we've got to consider universal pre-K. I want to say to Mr. Mitsuzi from Oregon and Ms. Bonamici, I can say that you stand as a textbook example of where we're trying to go as far as free community college for our communities. And I want to know, what has the Portland Community College, what kind of recommendations could you give to the community colleges around the nation who are going to benefit from the American Families Plan, this once in a generation plan? And what can you and Ms. Bonamici, as you talked about the American Promise Grant, and what can you say today to these other counties, my county, Dade County, Broward County, to offer free community college to students? And what do we do with that second 2 years that's not in the American Families Plan?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And Representative Bonamici, would you like me to answer? Or?
Oh, no, this is for you, not Ms. Bonamici.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Just getting used to the protocol. So thank you for the question. I think the America's College Promise will help generations of students access the community college in a more equitable way. And one of the biggest barriers that our students run into, in fact, 2/3 of our students, according to the Real College Survey, are basic needs and security. And so in addition to assisting with tuition, there are parts of the American College Promise Act that incent the states to change some policies in order to improve access to public benefit programs while students are going to college, so that they don't have to worry about what they're going to eat, where they're going to sleep, or other barriers that they have. One of the big reasons some students dropped out was because they were caregivers. Either they were taking care of their kids, they're taking care of parents, or they're taking care of siblings. And to the extent that there's support for them while they're going to school, they're going to finish. They're more likely to be able to complete. And it's when they complete and they earn that certificate or they earn that associate's degree that they achieve escape velocity out of poverty. Also, basic needs and security is an equity issue. Because of the history of our country, it's communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by poverty, by food insecurity, by housing insecurity. And being able to improve access to post-secondary education is also an equity issue, and it's an anti-poverty measure. You can't, once somebody earns that credential, like Dr. Tara Roberts, you cannot take that away. I mean, they have the knowledge, they have the skill, and they're more likely to be able to earn a living wage, and then their children are more likely to graduate as well. So what we do is something called Pathways to Opportunity. And this is a project led by PCC, and we work with the Oregon Department of Health Services, and we're working on integrating benefit programs and wrapping around students while they're in school and helping them to graduate. So when you add America's College Promise on top of that, you know, graduation rates are going to increase. Students are going to be able to focus on school. It's just so hard to focus on school when you're hungry or when you're not sure where you're going to sleep. That makes it really, really hard to finish, or how your kids are going to be taken care of, especially now during the pandemic when everybody is at home. For the last 2 years, for the transfer work at the state level is also very critical. And so I know there's work going on across the country and regionally. WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, has something called the Interstate Passport that helps to reduce credit wastage during the transfer process. In Oregon, we're doing transfer mapping. And so there are strategies that can be employed to facilitate transfer, make sure those credits are not wasted, and that students graduate from a 4-year as well.
Thank you so much. My time is up, Mr. Chair, but I want to put in the record some articles I have. One says 3 million kids missing from school because of COVID-19 is a travesty. The other one says report estimates 1 to 3 million students missing from school since March. And the other unprecedented numbers of students have disappeared during the pandemic. Schools must work harder than ever to find them.
Thank you. Without objection, those will be entered into the record. And that gives us some issues to use our oversight responsibilities to make sure that the school districts are using the money we sent them from the rescue plan to take care of that problem. Thank you. Next member to be recognized is the gentleman who appears to have landed in his office. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Rydell, I appreciate your data related to the current spending levels. One of the big issues in my district is workforce. And as I understand it, we still have about 10 million people on unemployment, and then we got about 20 million work capable people trapped in poverty on government programs, and we can't seem to get those folks to go to work. And so, but at the same time, we're throwing all this money at the problem. And the big issue, and is there some data out there that, I mean, employees and employers are telling me that the problem is the enhanced, well, one is the stimulus checks. And of course, let me say that Georgia's economy is only off about 0.6% right now. We've had an amazing comeback. Of course, we opened early and under CDC requirements, and did all the things we could do to do it right under our governor's leadership. But what bothers me is, all this money we spent for stimulus checks and for enhanced unemployment, yet what's keeping the economy growing is the workforce, which we've all admitted to here today. Why do intellectuals in Washington, D.C. think that they know more about what a state or a county or a city need to do to fix this problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The enhanced unemployment, especially, it was originally $600. Now it's $400 federal bonus. It made a lot more sense back when we didn't want people to go to work. I don't think it was a major disincentive a year ago or 8 months ago when for the most part, we wanted people to stay home. But now that the economy is reopening, now that people are getting vaccinated, we want people to go back to work. All of a sudden, the $400 bonus can become a disincentive. There's an economic consensus that overly generous unemployment benefits do provide disincentives to work. The $400 bonus right now is more than the median unemployed person earns in the short term. So again, it wasn't a big problem when you didn't want people to work, but as the economy reopens over the next couple months, that's going to become a bigger barrier that Congress is going to need to look at possibly before it expires, because otherwise you're going to see a lot of help wanted signs and a lot of people saying, well, maybe I should wait until August or September because I might actually lose money.
Yes, but my colleagues just a month ago passed a highly partisan, we viciously opposed this stimulus bill that has created the problem. I mean, $2 trillion. Now we're looking at another $2 trillion. I mean, you know, the taxpayers are going to get very tired of this. Tell me something on the scale of where this debt's going. And let me tell you, Republicans and Democrats both are responsible for it. I'm not laying it on my friends, you know, but the bottom line is, it's not sustainable. We've seen what it's done to other countries, and we see where our position is right now. And also from a national security standpoint, it increases our security risk enormously, because all of a sudden, if a country said, okay, we're pulling all of our investments out of the United States, people aren't standing in line to buy our debt anymore, we got a big problem. So tell me about your work with that. And if we don't stop this, what could possibly happen?
Yeah, I mean, we're on course to have the debt go from $17 trillion to $35 trillion in a decade. This is remarkable. If the entire president's campaign agenda was enacted, the debt would hit $42 trillion at the end of the decade, up from $17 trillion. At that point, it's 130% of the economy, or 1/4 bigger than at the end of World War II. At least World War II ended and the debt came down. We right now are facing $100 trillion in baseline deficits over the next 30 years. You don't want the debt to go to 200-300% of the economy. That's too much for China and Japan to bail out, even if they want to. At that point, you really start to have to run the printing press and monetize it. Again, this is dangerous ground for us. And the danger is, once the debt gets that big, it's really hard to reverse it.
Yeah. I mean, it would take, under a mortgage, if you went to mortgage this debt, it'd take 500 years to pay it off. Those folks are not going to be happy with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Fox, and thank you to our witnesses, especially President Mitsui. In response to Representative Wilson's question,
You just said it's just, you can't.
to add, Representative Allen, I think you need to mute. Thank you. In response to Representative Wilson's question, I just want to add that PCC has a program called Future Connect, this wonderful program, and I know President Mitsui, you did submit some materials about it to support low-income first-generation students, and it really makes a difference. So I'm actually really glad we passed the American Rescue Plan, which my colleague was just talking about, because among other things, it's made vaccinations more widely available. It's helped schools and businesses get the support they need to reopen safely, but families and the economy are still struggling. And I'm very grateful that President Biden heeded my call for a $100 billion investment in workforce funding, and that he also included support for childcare and school buildings in the proposed American Jobs Plan. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to advance the plan so our communities can not just rebuild, but build back better. President Mitsui, thank you for your meaningful testimony. I recently joined Chairman Scott in reintroducing the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, which includes a $2 billion investment to revive the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training Grant Program, an important program with a long name, which supports, as you know, community college and industry partnerships in developing workforce programs. So how would this funding help community colleges like PCC scale up workforce programs, especially to support displaced, dislocated, and underemployed workers?
Thank you, Representative Bonamici. Yes, the TAC program was a landmark program that catalyzed systems change across the country. In particular, I think about the state consortia and how it made a huge difference in Oregon around career pathways. And career pathways, as you know, are short-term certificates that are stackable credentials with wraparound support services. And our career pathway program at Portland Community College has a 90% plus completion rate, and of course, high placement rates, and individuals are experiencing wage progression. Also, we have almost eliminated the equity gap. And so our students of color graduate at nearly the same rate as the average rate. When I was in Washington State at North Seattle Community College, we were part of Air Washington. That was a TAC grant with a state consortia. I can remember us being, there were several community colleges with avionics programs. We were all in the same room with a large major aerospace employer, and we all got on the same page on the curriculum. And we compared the knowledge, skills, and abilities for the different avionics positions. And then the employer calibrated their job titles so that when students graduated, they knew which jobs to apply for. We found that we needed to actually truncate our curriculum, make it more efficient, and that saves students time and effort. Multiply that times 50 states. And that's the kind of impact that TACT had. So we, having another version of that, at the same time where we have an infrastructure investment, it's really important to have a human infrastructure investment. Absolutely. So that we don't have the skills gap.
Thank you. And I want to use my last remaining time to ask Mr. Malik, thank you for your comments about childcare and for highlighting the importance of solving the childcare crisis. We know that when the pandemic hit, schools and communities got together and made sure that students could get meals during the day, even though the school building was closed. I'm really grateful for everyone in Oregon who worked on getting those meals to students. So I chair the Civil Rights and Human Services Subcommittee, and I'm working on an update to the Child and Adult Care Food Program to better address child hunger issues for early learners and their families. So Mr. Malik, you mentioned the importance of CACFP in your testimony. It currently provides up to 2 nutritious meals per day for children in care. So I'm now working on reintroducing my legislation to expand access to nutritious meals during the additional time that children are in care. So how would children who are in care for 8 hours a day or more benefit by receiving a third meal or snack? And how in general would this help working families? Mr.
Thank you for that question. The CACFP Child and Adult Care Food Program is so crucial. It delivers, as you said, billions of meals per year. Right now, I think it could really benefit from a few key changes to allow those 3 meals per day to meet the modern kind of structure of the childcare system, and as well potentially to kind of change those reimbursement rates, I think, for sites, which may be out of step with rising food costs, especially as childcare programs are striving to serve really healthy meals, which young children need.
Thank you. And I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The next person, thank you. The next person I have on my list is a gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher. Is he still on the screen? There he is.
Yes.
Mr. Fulcher. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a comment and a question just briefly, but in terms of the comment, I just want to share a perspective on the so-called free community college for the first 2 years. I know the intention is good. I know the intention is good. The only problem is it just doesn't work. And we've all, or at least most of us, have children or have had children or grandchildren. And if you don't have some skin in the game, if they're not somehow invested in this process, they're just not as serious about it. There's not the reward. If you offer something as a gift, if you will, then there's just simply not the same response, the same ownership. And that also carries over to what happens is in the classroom with these instructors. They now would have a large group of students who just simply don't care. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but that's certainly going to be a trend. And as we all know, there is no such thing as free. I'm asking you all to pay for my children's education, and you're asking me to pay for yours. That's how this really does work. There is nothing for free on that front. Also, what's bothersome and what leads to my question has to do with the federal and state match, the $1 for every 3 and so on. In our state, we don't have the benefit of a broad-based property tax, which many states use as a mechanism to fund their education system and other things. The reason for that is we don't own the land. It's a federal state. We're a tenant in the state. The federal government has 2/3 of the land mass. And so that's a continuous struggle. Other states have similar issues if they've got large percentages of federal land. So to that end, I'd just like to steer a question now to Mr. McCloskey on that front. If there is such a piece of legislation that says, hey, the federal government is going to kick in $3 or whatever that number is, but the state needs to kick in $1. What is the assurance that we may have the federal government, being $30+ trillion in debt, will continue to be able to do that? Because the state is on the hook after that. Mr. McCloskey.
Yeah, that is a very real problem. The first thing I'd say, though, is, of course, we have way too much money in higher education right now. If you break it down by per pupil, we've seen huge increases in the total amount spent for decades. So there's a lot of money there. But what we've seen in other countries, when you compare OECD countries, the more that you get direct subsidies to a school, so not as we've done it through students, but directly to schools, and we're talking about public colleges and universities here, the more the amount of money or the share of money comes from the government, the fewer resources there actually are in the schools as we look at the trend with these countries, because there is a limit to how much you can spend. And when you make something free, you incentivize more and more people to consume it because it's not their money. So you run into a big problem of there's only finite resources in the world. No matter how many good things we'd like to do with them, there's a limit. And you run into the problem of you incentivize people to go to school and you hit that limit on how much you can spend. And that's when you see things like rationing and sort of becoming, you have systems where you have to pass a test to access a university. And I don't think we want to go in that direction.
Thank you for that. And that makes sense to me. I have just one follow-up question, just because I have either the benefit or the drawback of serving in our state legislature, in particular on the finance committee, but I've seen this happen before. When the federal government offers a program or offers money, oftentimes there are strings attached that come with it. And those strings don't necessarily reflect the local value system or the local priorities that come along with it. If this were to be put into place, what would you envision as to be some of those strings that the federal government may want to put on those dollars as a prerequisite for them being offered?
Well, things I've seen suggested in the past are, well, you would put limits on what schools can spend their money on. Now, partially it's well intended. You don't actually want colleges and universities to have those water parks, but it would also be quite possibly rules about, well, you can only have so nice a student union, or your food can only be so good. And certainly we have extreme expenditures on that with the subsidies to students, but it's very dangerous if the federal government, to get money to run a school, starts saying, well, here are the sort of things you cannot make better. What's really good about our system, and what probably makes it the best in the world in higher ed, is that schools do have to respond to students. And in many ways that makes them better, including access to professors, nice campuses, and lots of things like that.
Mr. McCloskey, thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Our next member is a gentleman from California who made quite a sacrifice to get here. Thank you, Mr. Takano, for being here today. I understand you had to take the red eye, and you're with us today at noon. So thank you so much. Gentleman from California, Chairman Takano.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I'll do my best not to be grumpy. My first question is to Mr. Malik. Mr. Malik, some of my colleagues across the aisle have suggested that federal investments in preschool would be harmful for children, a claim that I believe is false. As even Mr. Rydell, one of the Republican witnesses, stated, there is a vast literature demonstrating that preschool yields favorable short-term outcomes for young children. Moreover, there is a growing literature showing that preschool benefits last into adulthood. Children who attend preschool are more likely to graduate from high school and earn higher wages than their peers who do not attend preschool. Can you confirm my claims, Mr. Malik?
Yes, Congressman, there is a vast and very strong literature in economics and public policy research showing that Head Start, that broad-based investments in early childhood education, in preschool, universal preschool, all have benefits in the short term educationally and in the long term. And I think the reference to harmful outcomes is referring to the Quebec Universal Pre-K program that was instituted in the 1990s. And what I would say to that is that there's a lesson to be learned there, and that lesson is integrated into the Child Care for Working Families Act, which is you do not do this on the cheap. Doing that will only shuttle lower income families into low quality programs. And this approach that is outlined in the Child Care for Working Families Act does quite the opposite.
Mr. Malik, by high quality, we mean, there's many elements to it, but a central element is that we have well-trained teachers, that these instructors, we just can't, it's not babysitting, that there is learning going on.
Yeah, quality has two components. There's the physical things that you need for a good educational program. And that's important to invest in the physical infrastructure. But I would argue more importantly, especially for early childhood education, it's those interpersonal interactions, it's those important moments of hearing and understanding and listening to children, of developing those social, cognitive, emotional skills.
Well, thank you. So that means trained teachers. We've already spent $39 billion for childcare under the American Rescue Plan. For the how are those funds helping the childcare sector?
Yeah, those dollars were crucial because the childcare sector suffered an unprecedented set of losses last year. About half of programs reported going into debt, personal debt in some cases, to try and keep the doors open. Enrollment dropped by 50% and more, even after programs opened up after being closed for months. So the childcare programs were already on super slim margins. Their operating costs went up with all of the safety and health protocols necessary. Enrollments went down and they were in the red. And so those dollars were crucial.
My time is short. Why do we need to spend more under the American Families Plan?
What we need is a permanent long-term fix for what got us into this situation in the first place. We need to invest in the workforce, as you mentioned. Quality comes from those early educators. And right now, with an average childcare educator making $12 an hour, I mean, that leads to high turnover, that leads to economic stress for those educators. It does not set us up for success.
Thank you. Mr. Mitsui, I only have 30 seconds left, but you made a comment that really struck me. You said that one of the things impacting completion rates among community college students is lack of access to childcare. So we're talking here both about enabling people to get back to work and to jobs. If that makes sense, you need childcare for that, but you also need childcare to help students complete their programs. Is that right?
Absolutely. Gallup has indicated a high percentage of caregivers stopped out because they needed to take care of their children, siblings, or parents. And that means they can't complete their training and education they need to fill these jobs.
So we also need elder care as well, assisted with elder care. We spoke on child care, but that people who are older in their 30s, 40s, needing to take care of aging parents, that's also an issue. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, sorry I went over. And I hope I wasn't grumpy.
Thank you so much. You did well. Next, we have the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks.
Thank you so much, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and to all of our witnesses. I think it's vastly interesting listening to this topic of conversation. I'm from a family of 8 children. Neither of my parents were college educated. And so I find it interesting that listening to this discussion, my parents and siblings would not be trained teachers and would not have been able to somehow produce a child that's the first generation college graduate and the only one in their family to ever go to or go to medical school and graduate. So I think we should be cautious on what we consider to be trained and adequate childcare, because there are millions of parents out there with no college education and no training who raise phenomenal children, children who have done amazing things to put men on the moon, developed airplanes, developed educational systems, and help start businesses that are Fortune 500 companies, all from very little resources. And because of that, that is the genesis of my question. There has been so much, I think, especially in K through 12 and in our society, that really is funneling students towards baccalaureate degree programs. And for many, it is their sole focus. But there are others of us who advocate for a variety of post-secondary options for students. Mr. McCluskey, in your written testimony, you write, in 1960, only 7.7% of Americans 25 years and older had a bachelor's degree or higher. In 2019, the number was 36%. The important question is whether this was a net gain for society. And if you can very briefly elaborate on what you mean by whether this is a net gain for society.
Sure. So we often talk about education, and the shorthand for are we getting more education is, do we have more degrees? Do we have more attainment? But what we really want to know is, are people getting more skills and knowledge that are of value to them and in the economy? And that's why, unfortunately, in higher ed, we don't have a lot of standardized tests, but we do have 2. We had, again, the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, 1992 to 2003. And then more recently, we have the PIAC. Both of them had 2 administrations. And you could see that the literacy levels, this is prose literacy, can you read a newspaper article? There was document literacy, can you read a tax form and understand it? And there was also sort of whether you were literate in math, whether you were numerate. And what we saw was prose and document literacy have been dropping consistently as we've increased credentials. The sort of good news is we've just stayed sort of flat when it comes to numeracy. But what this strongly suggests is that we're not actually creating more knowledge, more skills. We're creating more pieces of paper called diplomas. And that isn't what we should be aiming for. And we're doing it for a lot more money for each one of those diplomas.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Riedel, I believe incentives matter. As a state senator, we often address this when we were looking at healthcare professions. And when I would meet with colleges, would talk to them, we can do other loan programs, we can do scholarships, but what are you doing to lower prices? So, Congress, I think, well-intended, has wanted to make college accessible and affordable. That was the point of government-backed student loans and now direct federal student loans. While this is an admirable policy goal, colleges and universities were able to increase their prices because students had easy access to credit and, in essence, a guaranteed payment program. So it would cover that higher balance. So this in turn created more risk of going to college, more risk of indebtedness. And I think if you could just address that in the brief time I have left to me, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, it makes sense theoretically. Colleges will charge as much as their target students are willing to pay. And as their financial resources rise with student aid, colleges will capture that aid. We see the same thing happen in healthcare. Since 1978, the price of college tuition and fees has increased 1,335% versus CPI inflation of 293%. So it's grown 4 times faster than inflation. And there is a link. The New York Federal Reserve confirmed a few years ago that each dollar in subsidized student loans brings a 60-cent rise in sticker price tuition, which even goes to the people who don't get the loans. So you give loans to one group and another group gets a higher tuition as well. Even Pell Grants raise tuition by 37 cents on the dollar. And so we have to be careful. We mean well when we do increase student aid, but if the colleges are just going to raise tuition to capture it, we're not really helping with affordability.
Thank you so much. I yield back my time, Chair.
Thank you. Next, the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this meeting today. To the witnesses, thank you for sharing your expertise as well. President Biden's American Jobs Plan commits, among other things, to address critical infrastructure needs at our K-12 schools, early child care facilities, and community colleges, and to provide needed support for workforce training and development. I'm pleased as well that the plan mentions investing in research infrastructure and research and development at historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. However, I think that HBCUs and MSIs deserve an even greater commitment to address their overall infrastructure needs and to support their efforts to build facilities in order to prepare students for 21st century jobs. I'm working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers on legislation right now to address this, and I look forward to seeing it considered by this committee in the near future as part of our efforts to advance this American Jobs Plan. Now, for my questions, President Mitsui, can you explain on the, can you expand, excuse me, on the infrastructure needs of community colleges across the country and beyond renovation and maintenance? Can you explain how additional funding would help community colleges purchase the up-to-date technology and equipment necessary to provide students with the education they deserve?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So advanced manufacturing is a good example of a sector that requires very expensive equipment. And in order to stay on the leading edge internationally, we need big turning machines. We need additive manufacturing, laser sintering machines. We need equipment that is quite expensive if we're going to train and educate students to move into high wage jobs, actually where there are a lot of openings. And so take aviation science as an example. Jet engines are kind of expensive and they're really important. Our airframe power plant students need to get it right, and there are great jobs waiting for them when they complete. As we transition also to electric vehicles, we're going to need to install a lot of electric charging stations across the country. And how do you do that? How do you train that? If you're an automotive tech, how do you repair an all-electric vehicle without electrocuting yourself? That's a really important basic skill, right? So all of these are skills that do require equipment. And by being able to invest in leading edge equipment, we're going to have leading edge workers.
Thank you, sir. This investment in community colleges is critical, and I know our HBCUs need it as well. Mr. Lander, in your testimony, you discussed some of the challenges that individuals face in accessing affordable childcare, transportation, food, and housing, which often prevent them from enrolling in education and training programs or even getting a job. So how important is it to provide equitable access to supportive services through WIOA, and should we be considering expanding access to these supports through the American Jobs Plan?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. This is so critical, really, these basic support services. We don't need, reports and studies to tell us that an individual will really not be successful finding and obtaining a job if their basic needs are not met as well. These support services you mentioned are all basic needs that will hinder one's success in obtaining education and finding a job. Things like childcare, housing, food, medication, tools, license fees. These are things that people making less than $27,000 a year just cannot afford and will keep them out of education. And so the second part of your question, yes, we should expand the uses to support services in many different ways. The dollars should be available in amounts so that they're not rationed. In my career, I've seen support services ration because there's just not enough money to meet the demand and the need. We need to expand the types of services that are allowable so that we can really break cycles of inequities. Things like car repairs and purchases for cars, grooming for homeless individuals, housing are really critical and often overlooked support services. And then lastly, really critical, support services need to be offered early in job training programs and later in job training programs. So for example, after somebody obtains a job, we can provide support services so that they can keep a job and then get a better job, moving to quality jobs and moving them out of poverty.
Sir.
Thank you.
I'm out of time. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Good, thank you. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for your participation today. Dr. McCluskey, one of the central arguments you made against free college park proposal is that it will likely make post-secondary education less responsive to students. This sounds very familiar to me. I'm the ranking member of the K-12 subcommittee, and I can tell you one of the weaknesses of our public education system is how unresponsive to parents it can be. We're seeing that frustration today in the forced closing of our schools. Yet Democrats want to convert our current federal student aid system in post-secondary education into something that looks more like the K-12 model. For all the faults, at least federal students and aid generally goes to students and follows those students to the institution they choose. Is there some reason to think that funding educational systems rather than the students will give us better results if we put it into post-secondary level that is now in the elementary and secondary level?
Right. I think one of the things we've seen actually very clearly, more clearly than even before with COVID-19, is that public schools often are not very responsive to parents. And it can be hard because you may be trying to serve different kinds of parents, but we've seen a lot of parents say, I want my school to be open. I want it to be in person. What we've seen from CDC report and research is it's safe to be there, but these schools will not open for us. On the other side, private schools were very responsive with in-person education. They're very responsive, providing sort of substantive education right very soon after lockdowns began. And there is a fundamental difference of incentives. The public schools, although local, and that's often good, they still don't respond directly to parents. Parents don't get to decide whether the money comes or goes. And so they tend to be less responsive to what parents want. In higher education, we do have a lot of excess because there are so many subsidies that come to the students. But there's no question that lots of college and universities are very responsive to what students want, what they desire. It's that sometimes those desires are kind of excessive because they're paying for college with so much money that actually comes from other people, and those other people are taxpayers.
Thank you so much. Mr. Riddell, you mentioned in your testimony that the middle class will have to pay the taxes to cover our federal government's spending commitments. Why is that? And what are the estimated tax increases on the middle class that will be needed to be covered with our current commitments and those proposed by the Democrats?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Let's assume that we can pay for the entire president's agenda on tax hikes for the wealthy and corporations. It's pretty unlikely, but let's assume we can. You still have an underlying $100 trillion in 30-year budget deficits. And at that point, you've already maximized taxes on the rich and corporations for other priorities. So how are you going to close that $100 trillion shortfall? Forget balance the budget. Let's just try to stabilize the debt at its current share of GDP. To do that, you would need to close a budget gap rising to 6% of GDP. If you were to do that with taxes, you would need either an 18% increase in the payroll tax or a 35% value-added tax. You'd basically have to double taxes on the middle class just to pay for the programs in the current baseline over 30 years. And again, you have to do that because you already used up all your upper income tax hikes to pay for all the new spending. That's the danger. Once you use up all those tax hikes, The middle class is all that's left to pay for the rest. And that's what Europe does. Europe finances their big government on value-added taxes and payroll taxes on the middle class.
Okay, thank you so much. And in a little bit of time I have left, Dr. Mikulski, my next question relates to the first one. It's interesting you use the NAEP scores to discuss the lack of progress we've seen in educational outcomes as spending has exploded. The Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas recently released a study that compared the NAEP scores to the level of educational freedom available in the states. Their study concluded that, quote, higher levels of education freedom are significantly associated with higher NAEP achievement levels and higher NAEP achievement gains, unquote. Dr. McCluskey, given this, shouldn't we shift the K through 12 funding to a more student-focused model?
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say that the federal government should do it. I don't think the federal government should be involved, but clearly what we've seen in that study and many others is the more that parents are able to make decisions about where their kids and the money to educate them go, the better the outcomes, because then the schools have to respond to those families. It's not about how well they lobby or negotiate a bureaucracy. It's the parents will leave if we don't provide what they want. And interestingly, that study also showed it controlled for a lot of different variables, and it showed actually negative correlations between the amount of spending and NAEP scores.
Thank you so much, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Desarnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panelists. Want to say hello to someone I've known for many years, Bob Lanter. Nice to see you, Bob. Just maybe an observation and welcome the panelists to make any comment. Having spent a good deal of time in the last few months around infrastructure, also being on the Transportation Committee, strikes me obviously that infrastructure changes. The foundation of this country, infrastructure was very different. And as we struggle to define that under the purview of this committee and how much that infrastructure needed, as I understand it, and I look at the definition, the dictionary definition, the support system that helps for productive households and individuals. So clearly, in my mind's eye, education, preschool, vibrant preschool, after school programs. I'm at another hearing right now about hunger in America, and we're focusing a lot on youth hunger. The infrastructure has to be efficient and effective. So maybe we're having the wrong argument as I listen to these debates in Congress about what the federal government's role is. I think the federal government's role should be helping states and local, and here I agree with the ranking member, to facilitate the conversation about what the client needs. And in this instance, it's that productive citizen in America who needs early education, who needs the kids to be well fed and connected to the private sector, as somebody who used to be in the food industry. So as we try to define infrastructure, maybe we need more performance standards, but all of us to be less ideologically driven about delivering the infrastructure and the support system to two-income households, to single-parent households who are under a lot of stress everywhere in this country, and in an area like I represent in the San Francisco Bay Area, where our housing costs are so difficult, but our transportation costs are so difficult because people have to spend a lot of time commuting, as we see commutes starting to go back up as gratefully we get out of COVID. So if any of you wanted to comment on that, could we change the conversation? Maybe Mr. Scott, the ranking member, we could try to change that conversation about the appropriate role to help a very different social model where we've got two incomes in households driving a long way, changing careers often. As we look at traditional transportation infrastructure, there clearly needs to be more, and public education is part of that. And if we can make public education perform better and be more client-driven, the client being the individual student and their families, let's all focus on that. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the discussion. If any of the panelists want to respond to that observation, I'd like to have their insights.
Thank you. I'd like to respond. Thanks, Congressman DeSaulnier. It's really nice to see you back in action. You know, your words, I think, are critically, should be critically listened to, because, you know, I think we have really realized that the workforce development services are needed in this country by millions of individuals. And it sounds cliche to say that there's just not enough funding in workforce development, but our system of public workforce development was built in a time when our economy was humming along. We had very low unemployment and individuals weren't really struggling to find work, except those that we serve in the public workforce system, those kind of that you mentioned, Mark, and painted a picture of, that are struggling to make ends meet. And I think we realize now today that the interventions that are needed are going to come at a cost. And these services need to be funded not only to workforce boards, but the network of workforce stakeholders, and that they really need to think innovative about how to expand access to services, Mark, so that we don't think about brick and mortar as infrastructure, but we think about access and equity as infrastructure. That's what I will say to that. Thank you.
Since my time's almost up, Mr. Chairman, the definition of infrastructure is the capital infrastructure, but also the organizational infrastructure that goes to support productive workers, from my perspective, and people who are struggling to be productive workers. So I look forward to having this discussion when we're back together with the ranking member and some of my colleagues across the aisle, because I think it's a good one. Thank you, Mr. Scott. I yield back.
Thank you. The next member to be recognized is my distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our guests. Dr. McCluskey, this discussion is a continuation of the Democrat philosophy that, number one, more money is the answer to everything. Two, the federal government should be intimately involved in every aspect of our lives. And three, it's the responsibility of the federal government to provide womb-to-the-tomb care for its citizens. The fact is, many American families sacrifice for one parent to provide the ideal at-home care for young children. And my wife and I actually did this as a young, lower middle-class family many years ago. Why should these families be penalized and taxed to fund those who are making other choices? Furthermore, why are we incentivizing and subsidizing single parenting versus the ideal two-parent family structure? And what's the evidence for the results achieved to justify the trillions we've invested in K-12 and higher education? And as with higher education, would not greater federal spending on childcare serve to drive up our costs? So Dr. McCluskey, if you could please comment further on the constitutional justification for the federal government being involved in providing childcare and the demonstrated connection between more federal spending and better outcomes in terms of cost and quality.
Sure. Well, so again, the Constitution doesn't authorize federal spending on education, and it's important to understand that the federal government is supposed to be limited to specific enumerated powers. But as sort of an impact, a policy impact, what we see in higher education, what we see in K through 12 is that more money doesn't seem to correlate with commensurate improvements in outcomes. Sometimes they are negative outcomes. And I do think it's important that we understand that there's been mention of, well, is pre-K, early childhood, can those programs be damaging? In fact, there is research that suggests it can be, that the best place for a child, if possible, is that they are, with one parent all the time, and that we don't have them in a child care situation. Now, obviously, some people will need to work. And it is a very serious concern that we would put money into, maybe in the hands of people to pay for childcare, and that drives up the price of childcare. And it's also really important to understand that actually research shows that there is very often research has shown a fade out, that there are early years of some improvements, but that it fades out over time to the point where, for instance, Head Start ends up not making a difference. And some of those long-term studies that are often cited were of two very specific programs, Abecedarian and Perry Preschool, hyper-intensive, treated only about 57 kids each. So I don't think, when I look at the early childhood research, that it is a sort of a home run showing that we know it works. In fact, once you dig into it, it gets pretty murky. And one of the things we see actually regularly is a fade out problem.
Yes, thank you, sir. And I want to direct my next question to Mr. Riedel. As you mentioned, the Davis-Bacon Act is incredibly wasteful, drives up costs by billions of dollars, and it is in fact a holdover from the Jim Crow era and was enacted in 1931 solely to disadvantage minority contractors. That's why I introduced HR 2218, the Davis-Bacon Repeal Act, unfortunately had no Democrat co-sponsors. Mr. Riedel, can you please comment further on the increased costs from Davis-Bacon, how it represents favoritism for the small percentage of unionized workers in the construction industry, and how much we would save from its repeal?
Yeah, I mean, if we want our infrastructure dollar to go further, you can't have a policy that raises wage costs by 22%, the overall cost of construction by 9%. It costs jobs. We could add 155,000 construction jobs for the same cost by repealing Davis-Bacon, 155,000. It's also terribly designed. Most of the formulas to determine the prevailing wage in most regions haven't been updated since the 1970s. So in some places like New York, you have to pay double the market rate wage. In other places, the Davis-Bacon is lower than the minimum wage. So I'll give another example. A GAO investigation found that the formulas for determining the prevailing wage were wrong in 100% of localities sampled. So it's an out-of-date, poorly run program that hikes wages 22% and raises costs by 10%. We could save about $12 to $15 billion by pulling this program back, and you'd still be paying good construction wages for good construction work. This should be a no-brainer to be more productive. And
thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Riedel. Thank you, Dr. McCluskey. And I yield back my time, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is exciting to be talking about the Build Back Better plans of the president. And let me just remind my colleagues that the $2 trillion infrastructure proposal, the president's proposal, enjoys 68% support across the country. The upcoming plan, the Families Plan, enjoys 65% support. So these are intensely popular. People want the government to be involved in helping to build their lives and to build their opportunity. I just want to start by adding a personal welcome to President Mitsui. We were so sorry to lose you from Seattle, but it's wonderful to have you still not so far away and bringing your voice to this forum. As you may remember, it was 2016 when I first introduced the Washington Promise into the state Senate to make community college free for everyone in our state, and how great it is that we see that proposal in the President's Families Plan, even as we do more to cancel student debt and address four-year colleges as well. If we want a successful jobs bill that creates union jobs with living wages, we have to include in the same single package this comprehensive support for families, including support for working parents, domestic workers, paid leave, as well as real reforms to healthcare. Today, I want to focus my questioning on just two pieces that I've been focusing a lot on regarding childcare. And the first is that we do not put up unnecessary barriers in the way with onerous work requirements, and that we ensure that we expand the income threshold cap to include the wide swath of middle-class folks who also need these benefits. So Mr. Malik, it's good to see you. Let me start with you. Childcare is essential infrastructure, but work requirements do impose unnecessary restrictions on access. The requirements on subsidies are arbitrary. They vary in both definition and enforcement, state to state. And according to recent CRS estimates, if we expanded childcare subsidies with work requirements in place, it would automatically exclude half of children under 75% of state median income. In your article from last year, you wrote that women, especially women of color, face higher unemployment rates and racial discrimination in hiring, and yet need to access childcare in order to remain in the labor force. Would you say that work requirements can be unfair barriers to otherwise qualified families even applying for or accessing childcare? And you can just give me a short yes or no answer.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. Yeah, just simple work requirements are not really the way to effectively connect families with what they need in terms of childcare.
Thank you so much. And in your testimony, you had said that childcare access needs to come before people can start looking for work. So if we were to remove work requirements, don't you think it would help the neediest of families access childcare?
I mean, I think from what I've looked at with the Child Care for Working Families Act, what it does really importantly in this new version is it expands the entitlement to people looking for jobs, which kind of removes that friction from I'm out of work, I'm looking for work, I'm getting back into work, can really, in the current status quo, eject families out of the childcare system that they need. It also, though, expands to parents seeking education. There are more than 4.5 million student parents who really, really need childcare in order to continue and to complete that educational training, as well as when there's this other provisions in there. So I'm encouraged. I think that ultimately getting to universal coverage is where we want to get to, and this gets us a big part of the way there.
Thanks, Mr. Malik. I agree. There are some important provisions that help us expand. My concern is that working parents are already struggling to come up with thousands of dollars. And, I think that the CRS estimates that half of children from low and middle income families would be left out is very troublesome. I want to call to people's attention the work that's been done on scarcity. Research in behavioral science has consistently shown that work requirements are very tough, and small hassles can have a disproportionately large impact on whether and how people complete any process. So just for us to be successful with these benefits that care is so essential to all families across the country, we need to minimize the hassle and complexity and not have enormous forms and administrative costs that come from administering those complex work requirements. Let me just quickly spend a minute on, actually I have even less than that, just on the cap. The family childcare expenses are 47% higher now than it was before the pandemic. In Washington state, on average, Washington households are already spending 14% of their income on childcare, and middle-class families, especially those in my district whose median income exceeds the state level by 50%, in districts that are housing poor, where people are spending up to 50% of their income on housing, they're really feeling this blow. And so I'm hoping that as we move forward with this bill, we can make sure to expand the income cap, because as costs continue to rise, I think we need to stick to the HHS recommendation in 2016 that no family spend more than 7% of their income on childcare. We don't want to exclude some very critical families at the middle income range, particularly in our income, high income families. So thank you so much for that testimony today. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership on all these bills. Important hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Harshbarger. Gentlelady's still on mute.
So sorry. Can you hear me now? Are you good? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Fox and all the witnesses. I have a story similar to Dr. Miller Meeks. I was the first one to graduate from college and then went on and got a postdoctorate degree. My parents never graduated from high school. I worked full time. I went to school full time, and I raised a family full time. And I paid every loan that I had back, and could until they were completely paid. So it can be done. And that just strengthened my character, as a matter of fact, to where I could become a freshman member in Congress and take on the world, it looks like. But this is for Dr. McCluskey. Canceling the student debt hasn't been mentioned in the infrastructure package, but that doesn't mean that it may not be included in the legislation when the text is passed. Let me ask you a question. Would canceling this student debt fix the underlying problems that lead students to borrow over $1.5 trillion to finance their post-secondary education, sir?
If anything, I think, thanks for your question, I think canceling would increase the willingness of people to take out debt and more debt to pay for higher education, because the assumption would be, well, I can take on this debt, and just as we just saw, I won't actually have to pay it back. And so why not take more? Why not go to a more expensive school that may have, you know, the nicer food, the nicer buildings, the lazy rivers. And so if anything, it would exacerbate the problem to say, you know what, take on the debt. There's a good expectation it'll be forgiven.
Yeah. Well, second question is, what could Congress do to create space for the private marketplace to re-enter the higher education sector, and how would that benefit students?
Sure. So the federal government is by far the biggest lender in higher education. It's like 90% of the market or more. And that means it's crowded out lots of private lenders. The federal government should begin to reduce how heavily involved it is in student lending. You might start with the PLUS loans. There's Parent Plus loans, Grad Plus loans, but they are not targeted at all toward low-income families who are the ones who need the most help. So you start by reducing all those programs that funnel money to people who clearly do not need the assistance in order to pay for college. But that is, you know, it's counterintuitive, but that's how we return rationality, not just to college pricing with these incredibly inflated prices, but to college consumption, where we no longer have our thumb on the scale of saying, you should all go get a 4-year credential, whether it represents actual learning or not, because we're going to give you the money to do it. We want people to find it as efficient and as effective an education as they can get, not just another piece of paper.
Absolutely. When you know you have those loans due, you're going to do your best to make a good grade, get out and get a good job. And this next question, thank you, sir, is for Mr. Riedel. Let's stay along those lines, sir, and say that Congress were to pass legislation canceling that student loan debt. Is there any evidence to suggest this policy would act as a stimulus to the economy?
It would not be a stimulus to the economy at all for 3 reasons. First, the $1.5 trillion in benefits for borrowers would be offset by lenders receiving $1.5 trillion less in repayments that now cannot be spent or lent out. So it's a zero-sum transfer from one group to another. Second, any benefits to the borrowers would accrue gradually over the life of the repayment period. It's not like you get a huge cash windfall at your door for the amount of your loan. And third, student loan forgiveness, we have not determined this for sure, but student loan forgiveness may be taxable as income, meaning that if you get $50,000 forgiven, you may get a tax bill having to pay taxes on that $50,000 immediately in that current year, which would mean it actually hurts the short-term economy. So in that way, it's certainly, at best, it's not a stimulus. In worse, depending on tax law, it could be harmful.
Well, one last question. Who would benefit the most from the federal government wiping that debt away?
According to the Urban Institute, $544 billion in benefits would go to the highest earning quarter of people, and only $192 billion would go to the bottom earning quarter of earners. And that's because half of all student loan debt is held by graduate degrees, doctors, lawyers, MBAs. That's who benefits.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Connecticut. Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing today. The communities hardest hit by COVID are also the communities that have schools in the worst physical condition. A 2014 study by the U.S. Department of Education estimated that it would cost $197 billion to bring all public schools into good condition. It's been 7 years since that study. Ms. Filardo, does your current research show any data about the cost it would take today to bring schools into good condition?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a little bit tricky because there is not a national database, or there's not really great data on some of this. But what we know is what it takes to keep schools in good repair. And it takes about $100 billion a year. And we know we've been spending about $50 billion a year. So we're running a deficit of about $50 billion a year. So you can do the math. In 10 years, you're at $1 trillion deficit.
Well, thank you. I don't have any scientific evidence, but if only 3% of our schools were in disrepair, they must have all been in my school district.
Yeah.
Because in 15 years, I can tell you that we've had so many
You're right.
buildings
You're right.
that
I
have
noticed
many
the
of
same
the problems that we are
thing.
discussing.
No,
During
I mean, yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Yes. So I can tell you from firsthand knowledge that many of our schools are in desperate need of attention, and we need to revisit. I mean, it's over a decade, and this pandemic has only further exacerbated these problems and shown us how the air quality, the physical space, mold, mildew, things that we've talked about, how it's so critical that we address these issues. So thank you. We've also seen, not just in the physical infrastructure, but gaps in our childcare system. We couldn't reopen the economy without thinking about how our children would be taken care of. And I would be remiss as a classroom educator if I didn't comment on the fact that I know for sure that children benefit from preschool. We can disagree on what that looks like. We can disagree on how it's paid for. But in this committee, I want the record to reflect that Congresswoman Hayes does not believe that preschool is counterproductive. Mr. Malik, according to Professor Tyron Morrissey at American University, on average, the early care and education settings attended by many young children, particularly low-income children or children of color, provide quality at levels too low to adequately promote children's learning and development. My question for you is, how does a parent identify what is high quality in a childcare system? And then what effects does the lack of high quality childcare have for children, communities, and our country?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's a very good question. And unfortunately, right now, it's very hard for parents to get all the information that they need on what programs are high quality, what quality does indeed look like, what the future of that program that they're enrolling their child or children in may be, because childcare programs have high turnover, have severe challenges in emergency situations such as pandemics, are very vulnerable to drops in enrollment and don't get the adequate funding that they need. Now, the second part of your question, I'm sorry if you could repeat.
What effects does the lack of high quality childcare for children have on communities and our country?
Yeah. So, the quality comes from the trained, professional, hardworking workforce of more than 90% women, disproportionately women of color, who have operated this industry on a shoestring budget for decades. And I just want to state here that this year they worked through this pandemic to serve all of the essential workers, the frontline healthcare workers. They were there when we needed them. They deserve an investment in the work that they have provided to our families and to the children that they have taught through the years, and that those quality investments pay for themselves many times over in terms of not just the educational outcomes, but the social and economic outcomes for children, and for, as I've said before, the security of those family units.
Thank you. I'll just close by saying educating my children doesn't only help my family, it helps your family and it helps our community. It is a public good. And Mr. Chair, with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Next, the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller. Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller.
You got to unmute, Mary.
Okay. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimonies. As the mother of 7 and as an educator that has spent time in public, private, and homeschool educational situations, school is very dear to my heart, and strengthening our families also. I believe that every child deserves a high quality education that meets their unique needs and gifts. I also believe that it's best handled at the local level. As we consider proposals related to K through 12 education, I hope that we consider how to keep DC bureaucrats out of the classroom and instead empower state and local educational officials to improve their schools. So my question is for Dr. McCluskey. You've demonstrated that pumping more money into our current K through 12 system hasn't done much to improve our math and reading scores. I share your doubts about being able to spend our way to better education. What reforms do you think would be effective in improving academic outcomes for American students?
Thanks. I mean, the number one reform is we need school choice. We need to fundamentally change how we deliver K through 12 education from a model where the government funds the schools and you are essentially assigned to a school. We've moved away from that somewhat, but that's still the norm, to a model where the money follows the student to the school or the other educational arrangement. You know, now we have pandemic pods, we have homeschooling, we have lots of other options, but it falls to what works best for that family and for those children, because all children are different. But that should not be a federal thing, other than in Washington, D.C. Certainly for people in the military, you can deliver school choice. Otherwise, it should be state and local. And the job of the federal government should be to stay out of the way, not to put rules and regulations on how K through 12 education functions.
And I have another comment. So, you know, I have the 7 children and we encourage them to seek merit scholarships and or to work. So they either worked part-time or full-time that entire way through school. But I have to say that we observed, because we had close relationships with some of our children's friends, that my children's peers that received free school were the ones, in our experience, that didn't graduate. They were the ones that moved out of their homes. They upgraded their vehicles and they spent their time partying and flunked out. And so my question to you, Dr. McCluskey, is so many of these people that are getting full tuition assistance end up dropping out. It turns out that only 60% of those that enroll in bachelor programs have completed their degrees 6 years after enrollment. Dr. McCluskey, what do you make of our abysmal 6-year graduation rates? And do you think free college proposals would have any effect on graduation rates?
Well, there's certainly a problem of when you're consuming something, when you're going to college using money that comes from somebody else and typically not somebody you know, so it's not family, you are less incentivized to finish and to finish as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So there's, I think, little question that the existence of subsidies have incentivized people to do a lot of other things in college than focus on completing a program as quickly as possible in an area that's in demand. But there is another problem to this, which is that it has made it expensive, much more expensive than education should be. So there are certainly people who do have to work because the price that they are presented with is so high, and it's so high because it's been artificially inflated by student aid. So no matter whether the problem is that you're not incentivizing people to get education as efficiently as possible and to complete it, or that the prices become so high, it's very difficult for some people to afford, it's that aid that's at the root of those problems.
Yes, and Dr. McCluskey, you've pointed out that many issues with the free college proposals, but you rightly acknowledge that college tuition costs are out of control. Can you recommend any policy proposals for the committee that would reduce the costs of higher education without the unintended consequences of free college?
Right. So instead of saying we make it free, we reduce those subsidies, the student aid programs, especially those student loan programs that aren't well targeted. Start with those. I think the Parent Plus loan and the Grad Plus loan in particular are good places to begin to add rationality to consumption and pricing by saying, we're not going to provide money to the people who don't need it. Let's at least focus our aid on those who do need it.
And I do have to add, if I may, that the experience of my children having to work and go to school at the same time did keep them out of some of the traditional landmines that college students fall into and gave them experience in the workforce while they were going to school. So that's very valuable too. And I don't think it should be discounted. And I don't think we should look at it as all bad, that people have to scramble and work or even be concerned about what they're going to eat or where they're going to live, because that's part of entering into adulthood.
Thank you.
And I yield my
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing today, and thanks to the witnesses. I can't begin to count how many priorities I'm excited to work to include in President Biden's infrastructure and jobs plans. But I want to take a moment first to focus on the idea of tuition-free community college, which bears little relationship to some of what I've been hearing here. As a former chief workforce officer for my home state of Michigan, I created a free community college program called No Worker Left Behind, and we put 162,000 un- and underemployed workers back to school. And we had waiting lists in every one of Michigan's 83 counties. And now recently, my governor, Gretchen Whitmer, created a tuition-free benefit for frontline workers who've kept our country running during the pandemic. But there's an important difference between the proposals before us today, including the America's College Promise Act that I introduced yesterday with you, Chairman Scott, and many of the recently created state-level programs. Unlike many state-run programs, America's College Promise would provide what's called a first dollar benefit, meaning that benefits are not reduced when a student receives other financial aid like the Pell Grant. So President Mitsui, let me ask you this. Can you talk about how this type of first dollar structure helps to ensure that students can use other financial aid to cover basic needs? What would it mean for their ability to stay enrolled and complete a degree, which many people have, talked about today?
It is vitally important. Thank you, Congressman Levine, for the question. As I mentioned earlier, and as research points out, 2/3 of our students in the community colleges struggle with basic needs and security. And I do want to point out that the survey that we conducted at Portland Community College, almost 19% of respondents indicated experience with houselessness.
Yes.
And this is not a rite of passage. This is living in a car. This is couch surfing or living in a tent, not being housed out in the cold during the winter and trying to study and trying to complete school.
So in other words, if we covered their tuition and books or whatever, then they would really need the money to be able to live. So I just think that's so important. Let me turn quickly to Mr. Lanter. It's good to see you too. I'm worried about the 4.2 million Americans who are long-term unemployed, especially given the additional challenges these workers face re-entering the labor market right now. The American Jobs Plan calls for a new dislocated worker program and a subsidized job program for the long-term unemployed and underemployed. Our committee is considering ways to expand dislocated worker supports through WIOA. And last week, I introduced a bicameral bill with Senator Chris Van Hollen to create a targeted subsidized job program for long-term unemployed workers. So from your experience in California, what additional supports do you think long-term unemployed individuals need to re-enter the workforce successfully?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Great question. It's nice to see you. Look, in my almost 30-year career working in the front lines of the public workforce development system, there are fewer people served by our system that are more challenged than the dislocated worker. Often long work history and coupled with a lack of reskilling over time is a recipe for long-term unemployment. So you asked what can we do? Well, look, our nation's retraining system must allow these laid off workers to not only receive education, but receive the necessary supports that we were just talking about that will help them complete the education and obtain employment. In California, we've started a critical program called Breaking Barriers, where we use $25 million of general fund money for partnerships between community-based organizations and workforce boards to enable the most vulnerable populations to receive the supports and have the remedial education necessary to complete their programs. That's the type of expansion we need.
That sounds outstanding. All right, well, before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I want to highlight the importance of the Build America's Libraries Act. You know, I'm all about the libraries, and the Reopen and Rebuild America's School Act. I'm a proud advocate for investing in our school and library infrastructure, and I look forward to working with you to ensure they're both included in the American Jobs Plan. We need to create great union jobs, rebuilding our infrastructure so that our kids and our communities have safe spaces to learn and grow. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank
Mr. Levin, this is Sablan. Could you add me on to your Build Library Act?
Yes, sir. You've got it.
Thank you.
No problem. Next member to be recognized is the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a very good discussion, you know, and someone who's went through a lot of education, work in education committee and state senate in Indiana. We have a lot of discussion. We have lots of problems. So I'll make a comment and then I have a quick question. You know, my observation looking at our educational system is really broken, and it creates with a lot of perverse incentives that happening with wrong outcomes. We're not ready for lifelong learning. And now that, you know, the pace of change is getting stronger, faster and faster. And we calculated in our state of Indiana, less than half of the money goes to classroom. And I think putting more money in fancy buildings is not going to improve in education. I went to pretty bad building originally back in Ukraine and had very good education. My father-in-law studied in one room school, and he became very successful in life. We can spend a lot of money on education buildings, but that's not what the quality of education. It's not going to get kids better and ready for this very difficult world with a lot of changes. And if you look at our country spends one of the pretty much almost the most per child on education, and in a lot of areas we have like somewhere 10th, 20th and in outcome and where we are. So I think it's unacceptable, it's very disturbing, and it's very bad. So my question is, how can we, is there any, and maybe I'll ask Mr. McCluskey, since Cato Institute sometimes more like a libertarian and can find a common ground between Republicans and Democrats and some criminal justices, for example. Is there anything, because we have discussions and debate, we talk about it, we all understand that something has to change, but we'll never come up with any solution if we actually don't look at restructuring the system, how we can provide fundamental skills in a better way, eliminate perverse incentive, have more skin in the game for institutions of learning, and get our kids ready to lifelong learning. We have the whole world to compete, and our kids are not ready. So I don't know, Mr. McCluskey, do you have any observations and thought if there are any policies that we actually could agree on and move forward, not just continue debating?
Sure, thanks for the question, and thanks for saying that I may be able to bring Democrats and Republicans together. I'm going to try the best I can do here. The first thing I'd say is I do think that there may be a chance if a lot of people look at the plus loans, Parent Plus and Grad Plus, that may be an area that a lot of people could agree this is very poorly targeted aid, and the less well we target higher education aid to those who need it most, to lower income families, the worse we make this price inflation problem. So maybe in higher education, that is a place where people can start looking at some of those programs that are not well targeted. And another area I think that there may be where we could get widespread agreement, not necessarily do I think it should be federal, but is at apprenticeships. But apprenticeships where we start with school choice at the K through 12 level, where we don't sort of constantly push people, say, really, if you want to be a full, person that that everybody will respect you have to get a 4-year degree. I think it's terrible how much we emphasize 4-year degrees, but we also don't want to track people and track students against their will. So we see charter schools, for instance, that do work towards apprenticeships, where people who want to learn, really valuable skills that aren't necessarily done in a college classroom, where they can choose that early on. And I think that's somewhere that a lot of people could agree is, let's make those kind of apprenticeships something that's a much more viable, easy to access option for people. Well, maybe they're still in high school.
Right, and I think we work in the state of Indiana, and ultimately it's not about 4-year degree. You can actually attain your bachelor's degree much faster. You cannot, in 10 years, you can really get, primary education. Your secondary and post-secondary education could be done at high school, and you can actually already have associate degree. I had my master's degree in 15 years back in Ukraine, and here for 13 years, you're still in school. So I think it could be done faster, and maybe looking how we can integrate. And I don't know if you have a look, integrate some of these technical skills in maybe some degrees that some people just want to have that piece of paper, although that's really doesn't matter, but at least they can get a piece of paper faster and get down and get the work and be productive member and maybe get another one. But I appreciate, if you have any other ideas, please reach out, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do represent Guilford County, North Carolina. We recently had an outside evaluation done on what it would cost to do the necessary repairs and upgrades to our K through 12 schools. And the cost was in excess of $2 billion. Ms. Filardo, school districts can use COVID relief funds for school facility repairs and improvements, thank goodness. In your testimony, you reference a letter from the National Council on school facilities that recommends school districts use 15% of funds to meet CDC requirements and reduce deferred maintenance of their facilities. Can you describe the need that remains beyond just my community and how the Reopen and Rebuild America Schools Act can build on this investment for schools across the country, not just North Carolina?
Yes, thank you. I know there's some confusion about sort of that maybe there's the money there is there to solve all the problems of our crumbling schools. And there's no question that if we actually took 15%, that there could be some progress made against deferred maintenance. But I calculated it for about 12 states that had given me their most recent data. And it's still about 3%. If they got the 15% for school facilities, about 3% of their need. I mean, I think one of the things that's really hard for people to appreciate is that the scale of this infrastructure is really enormous and complex. We really operate industrial-sized operations when you're talking about high schools and middle schools with, complex mechanical systems and heating plants of all different sorts that are used on buildings that might be 500,000 square feet. So it's fantastic what we're getting from the rescue plan for our school districts, but it just in no way makes progress against the really long-term issues that we're facing for resilient schools, for energy efficient schools, for schools that really need to meet the workforce and early childhood requirements that we know are a part of the responsibilities of our communities.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lanner, as I've been meeting with people from across my district, I have been hearing from a lot of the businesses in my state that they're having trouble finding a supply of qualified workers amid the COVID-19 pandemic, but even before that. For many, the ability to hire trained and qualified workers has been a long-standing challenge that was simply exacerbated by the pandemic. Can you help us, can you help explain the investments in the federal workforce system made through the American Jobs Plan and how those can address the long-term workforce challenges that I am hearing about and help us improve equity in our labor markets?
Yes, thank you. Congresswoman. It's an excellent question. And, you're absolutely right. The skills mismatch in our country has been around long before the pandemic. The thing about it is the pandemic is only going to exacerbate the challenges that individuals in our country had faced as we were going into the pandemic. And I think, the skills mismatch really is at the heart of everything we're talking about today. We have employers that are struggling to find talent and struggling to find individuals. And we have individuals who cannot see the path to those jobs. And this is where the America's Job Plan really helps. It can enable us to really retool the workforce development system. This is the place for that retooled sector strategy. In California, we've launched over 50 sector partnerships that bring industry, labor, workforce, and community-based organizations to the table. And what's really important about these partnerships is that it's driven by the demand of industry, and they're convened all over the state by intermediaries, by organizations who understand the challenge in these industries, and more important, understand that job quality is more than just wages. For individuals that you're talking about, Congresswoman, we're talking about set schedules. We're talking about career pathways. We're talking about childcare and benefits. So these partnerships can really help. The America's Job Plan can fund industry sector partnerships across the country that are industry-led, where partnership is a priority for long-term sustainability in an industry, where worker voice is incorporated so that we can ensure quality jobs beyond wages. Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Interesting discussion, especially I think my perspective as a former state legislator. I just say, I mean, my position is still to decentralize education, allow the governors of our states and the state legislatures and the school boards handle the vast majority of these issues, everything from curriculum to infrastructure. In Wisconsin, if a local school district wants to rebuild the high school, they put the question on a referendum and let the taxpayers vote on it. And right now in Wisconsin, over the last decade or so, there's been a record number of referendums that have passed because there's been in excess of 50% of the people that vote in that school district say, yeah, we need a new high school. Or no, we don't need a new high school or baseball field or swimming pool or whatever it might be. So it makes me nervous whenever I hear Congress stepping in the middle of that and saying, we know better and we can figure out a better way of doing this. And we're going to make sure that we're going to fund these things because we all know strings are attached and that's alarming. I'd also say, I think it's almost insulting the way it's come up numerous times today that infrastructure is extended beyond what we would traditionally define it as. And the reason it's troubling, I think, is because you're trying to put people in that definition. So you're talking about teachers, you're talking about school staff, you're talking about families, and you're talking about the actual students, the children. That's insulting to throw them in that mix and say, this is also infrastructure. No, it's not. And that's why the polling that you see is so wildly popular is because it's got to be that the people that are being polled are saying, we know what infrastructure is, and infrastructure is bricks and mortar, it's roads, it's bridges. And if you try and redefine it like I know is going on right now, you're undermining people that make a difference in our educational system. I just want to talk a little bit about, and Congressman Good talked about this a little bit too, Bacon Davis, but Mr. Riddell, I was going to ask you the question on project labor agreements. It kind of falls under the same area as Bacon Davis, but certainly every dollar spent on schools, whether it is done at the local level or whether it's some type of federal money that might make its way down to a school district. A lot of times these PLAs, they eat away at the amount of revenue that's actually available to finish a project. And you know, in Wisconsin, we did away with project labor agreements, and especially when it comes to any of the municipal projects going on, and it's really helped us a lot. I was wondering if you had a comment on that.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. And I'll say that when I was in Wisconsin, building on your point, we built Appleton North High School when I was in high school without any federal help. It was decided locally and they built it, and it's a great high school. And so I agree with that. Project labor agreements absolutely raise costs. They have been shown to raise school construction costs by anywhere from 13 to 30% in various states. And so, you know, money is limited. So when you're doing these infrastructure projects, you can do less. You can build, you can't build as big of a school, you can't build as nice of a school, or you can build fewer schools, because 13 to 30% is a huge increase in costs.
Yeah, and I'd just say, you know, in the PLAs that sometimes are involved in some of these projects as well, you know, they kind of push the project in a specific direction that otherwise, you know, probably wouldn't happen. And again, it increases costs. So interesting discussion today, and I would yield back, Chairman Scott.
Thank you. Next, gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Thank you so much, Chairman Scott, as well as Ranking Member Fox, for having this important hearing today. We're here today to talk about the actions we can take to strengthen our economy by creating jobs, investing in what we believe, and we believe in investing in our children and supporting families. But we can't do that without acknowledging the disparity and the hardships Americans have faced, right? So women in our country have lost a net 5.4 million jobs during the pandemic, nearly 1 million more job losses than men. Women of color were hit the hardest. Mr. Malik, I was a Head Start baby, which is where I fell in love with learning, and appreciate your testimony about the importance of funding quality early childcare, both to improve women's ability to return to the workforce, but also to invest in our children, because we know that is how we create a future for our communities. But when I meet with constituents, they tell me that the lack of affordable, reliable childcare holds them back, especially moms, from accepting well-paying jobs and becoming financially independent. And they want their children to be in those quality health, those quality early childcare situations that has been talked about today. We also know that poorer families don't always participate in programs like the free school lunches if the application process is difficult. So my question is, what can we do in Congress to make sure that all families can access early childcare, including the poorest who might not be comfortable with complicated application processes? And how can we make sure that families don't pay more than 7% of their income on childcare?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I think we absolutely need to we need to expand our investment in early childhood education as a public good, and consider all of the spillover benefits that we accrue throughout the K-12 system and throughout society. Those are well documented, you know, and I think we also have to prioritize making sure that that low-income families are the target population that we want to make sure gains access to these programs. Now that might, you know, that's a lot of that is the devil's in the details there. And I think that the Child Care for Working Families Act that we have now, the new version that's just come out, I want to note that there's a whole slew of eligibility categories that are aiming for the greatest take up to try and really make sure that families who have been left out of the system are brought in first, and that those dollars prioritize low-income and middle-class families for whom childcare is an economic necessity, but one that has just been too far out of reach. Now, in terms of capping the amount spent on childcare, I think right now there is this 7% number, of course, that HHS set as the kind of ceiling for affordability. The only families that are spending 7% on quality childcare right now are really high income families. And I've run the numbers on this, and you've got to be making 6 times the federal poverty level. So if you're over $150,000 a year in family income, on average, that group is the group that's only paying 7%. Everybody else is at 20%, 15%, 10% of their gross income spending on childcare among working families that are paying for it right now. So I think the way that the bill is structured, we're talking about making it free for low-income families, capping it at 2% for those who are making the state median income. And I think—
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Malik. I did want to get a quick question in with regards to the funding of of school construction. So Ms. Filardo, I think I wanted to see if you could talk quickly about the benefits that new school construction can have in addressing not just the need for school, but schools that have access to the technology that we need, and that also by building schools that are more resilient and environmentally conscious, that also attacks the other pandemic problem we have with regards to our global climate crisis.
Yes, so different than your colleague from Indiana mentioned, it really does make a difference, the quality of the environment that we're in. And we do better in better environments. And so we are underperforming in part because of the environment that we're in. And that's true from an academic level, it's true from an energy perspective, it's true from the resilience perspective, that our schools can be more resilient, they can be more energy efficient, they can be healthier, and all of these things, it takes money. And again, to counter some of the other, I think really misinterpretations of RASA, is it is not a takeover. It is really a program to strengthen the states and their ability and capacity to do this. And the National Council on School Facilities, who I work with, these fantastic state officials, from Alabama, from Georgia, from Maine, from Alaska, from New Mexico. These folks are really doing some fabulous work, but the states need more incentives to be able to do more to help the local districts. The decisions will still be local. They'll still be done at the state level. This is not a program where the federal government gets in between those decisions. Those referendums will still take place.
Thank you, Ms. Filardo. My time has expired, and we will welcome additional funding in New Mexico. I yield back.
I know you will.
Thank you. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and thank you, Ranking Member Dr. Fox. Congress has increased funding for K-12 schools, colleges, and universities over the last several decades, yet students' outcomes have not improved. We have heard from parents who spoke to this committee that the pandemic wreaked havoc on their child education. We have seen teacher unions, elected officials keep classrooms closed. We are seeing in California that parents are frustrated and ready for reform in favor of more school choice. According to the Public Policy Institute of California in 2020, school vouchers are very popular with parents, but California seems to be slow to implement new school choice and voucher options. We asked so many questions and answers since I am the one of the last ones. So I have a simple question to Dr. McCloskey, that do you think that providing parents with more options for their children, for example, charter schools, virtual school, homeschooling, and vouchers for private schools, do you think it would improve educational outcomes?
Oh, I think it definitely would improve educational outcomes. In fact, there are 29 or so studies on the competitive effects of having school choice. I think it's 27 of those have found that the more options parents have around a public school, the better that public school does, because you need those incentives of people being able to take their money elsewhere to really focus on the outcomes that parents want. So the research very much supports the idea that the more choice there is, the better the outcomes. And of course, there was the study that was mentioned earlier at the University of Arkansas that found that NAEP scores are better, they get higher when people have more choice in their states.
Thank you, Dr. McCloskey. Thank you for all the witnesses who came today. And Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for joining us today. With that being said, Mr. Chairman, before I ask my question, I wanted to point that the Davis-Bacon or prevailing wage provisions do not increase construction costs. The argument that prevailing wage laws increase construction costs relies on the flawed assumption that only the way a contractor can minimize labor costs is by paying workers less. This is false. In any industry, an employer can also reduce labor costs by reducing turnover and using wages to attract and hire the industry's most productive of workers. That being said, I would like to address my support for the Buy American provisions. I strongly believe that Buy American policies ensure that we are not missing out on good paying job opportunities in manufacturing across a range of industries in our community. Chairman Scott's Reopen and Rebuild America's School Act has a strong Buy American provision, including a melted and poured standard for iron and steel. The melted and poured standard is extremely important for the steel producers and steel workers of Indiana's 1st Congressional District, as well as workers across the country. I thank the chairman for recognizing the importance of the strong Buy American requirements. Mrs. Filardo, can you share why Buy American requirements, along with prevailing wage and project labor agreements, are important to the Reopen and Rebuild America School Act?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I've been really mystified by the negative comments about it. It's, you know, proper wages and the quality that we get from our school construction, from the project labor agreements, and frankly from union builders is just is well known. And we also know from building that was done under ARA, where, you know, in Texas and Arkansas and Georgia and California as well, spent money using the federal dollars, that they did not have a problem with Davis-Bacon. And in fact, in Georgia, they reluctantly explained to me that they thought maybe it was a little bit higher, maybe 7% that they had paid on a premium. But I would argue that you actually get something. You know, there might be a little premium, I don't care, if you get something for it. And we know that in this country, we didn't have schools fall down on top of kids like they did in China during an earthquake, right? So we have really safe schools. We have schools that are done at very high quality with our, you know, project labor agreements. And I think we should be proud of those. And I don't think we should be lowering those standards at all. And certainly in terms of Buy American, one of the amazing things and wonderful things about our public schools is that they do have, you know, equipment and supplies and materials in them that are really, they're full of them, frankly, with their furniture and equipment. And if we could be manufacturing more of that in this country, we'd be very, very well off. You know, in Indiana, I know there's locks and doors and hardware that comes out of Indiana, and all of this is really important to our schools. We need a lot of materials and equipment, and we should be manufacturing it here.
Well, thank you very much. And I just wanted to close with saying that the Reopen Rebuild America School Act, along with the Buy American provision, one of my colleagues, Congresswoman Sparks, asked what we can do together. And what I believe can unite our country is bring workers together and make sure that we're uplifting workers' ability to make a wage and a family sustaining income, along with health benefits and along with a secured pension. And as we go forward, I just want to thank everyone for your participation. This ties everything together with early childhood development, along with community college and dislocated workers, and making sure we get our workforce back on track and being able to provide for their families. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next member to be recognized is the gentlelady from Louisiana, Ms. Ledlow.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, members of the committee and witnesses, thank you for taking the time to discuss President Biden's newest legislative proposals, the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan. While I believe Congress should invest in education and workforce development efforts, we also must be mindful in evaluating 4 important areas before we start spending hard-earned taxpayer dollars. First, how much we spend and the effect it will have on our children and grandchildren. 2, the regulatory burden that Congress puts on use of funds, less government intervention, not more. 3, if we are addressing the root cause of the problem, throwing money at a program without addressing the challenges or how we can measure the success is not a wise use of taxpayer dollars. And 4th, the role of state and local governments for education spending. Most education spending is funded locally. Congress has already spent billions of dollars for education with the last several COVID-19 relief packages and stimulus bills. While some of the president's new proposals hold merit, like expanding broadband access to rural areas, I have serious concerns about piling on additional spending when many of the already appropriated funds have yet to be allocated and sent out by the federal government. My question is for Dr. McCluskey. Do you know where the United States falls in comparison to other countries in terms of elementary and secondary education spending? And where do we fall in comparison to other countries in terms of our outcomes for these students?
Yeah, we spend more than almost any other country. Certainly Luxembourg spends more and a few others. And if you look at international exams like the TIMSS exam or the PISA exam, especially if you look at math is where we struggle the most. It doesn't appear that, at least relative to other countries, they seem to generally spend less than we do. And they typically have better scores, especially again, if you look at the math, it's a little bit less when you look at reading, but it doesn't appear that we're getting the bang for the buck that we would like to get.
Thank you. And finally, there seems to be a perception that we are vastly underfunding education. Why do you think that that perception persists?
I think it's because a lot of the times we hear that, well, our schools, of course, are underfunded. It's repeating it as if it is a given truth. And what's interesting is there's polling, often polling been done the last few years, asking whether people think we've spent enough on education. And it's usually, maybe 60-some% or so say, no, we don't spend enough. And then when they're presented with the amount that we actually spend, that goes down by about 20 percentage points. So I think we're accustomed to hearing that we don't spend enough and that we're always cutting. But if you look at the numbers, only after the Great Recession, if you go back to the 1920s, only then did we see a dip in per pupil spending adjusted for inflation, and it has since come back and is back in record levels.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCluskey, and to the rest of the witnesses, thank you for your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Well, thank you so much. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and of course to the witnesses for testifying today. As I have listened to some of the questions and testimony, I am disappointed in some people at the lengths to which they will go to shortchange our students and teachers. One of the witnesses here today, Mr. McCluskey, has made the argument that we should not increase our investment in education because the average score on the National Assessment on Educational Progress has only seen a nominal increase. I would like to just note that while it's true that the average score has only seen a slight increase, scores for Black and Hispanic students have increased tremendously. Between 1975 and 2012, the average reading score for students only increased by 1 point, but during that same period, scores increased by 28 points for Black students and 22 for Hispanic students, and a similar trend can be seen with math scores. This shows that investing in students and schools, especially in poor communities and communities of color, improves outcomes and indeed does make a difference. We've also heard from others on this panel today that funding for education outside of federal lands is somehow unconstitutional. A deeply embarrassing and unserious argument that I never expected any witness before this body to make, frankly. And of course, we've also heard the tired argument that federal infrastructure investments are somehow inefficient and wasteful. This runs counter to Ms. Filardo's testimony and what we've heard from stakeholders, constituents, and experts, including the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office. And to Mr. McCluskey, who may or may not have actually read the Constitution, I feel the need to remind him that Congress derives its authority to craft and enact legislation from the spending and general welfare clauses in that very document. The federal government provides approximately 8% of all funding for K through 12 education. And what we are talking about today is the federal government playing a greater role in school infrastructure to improve the conditions of our nation's public schools. Ms. Filardo, school segregation continues to be a major barrier to educational equity. The legacy of decades-old discriminatory housing policies continues to exacerbate segregation in housing and in our nation's schools. According to a 2016 GAO report, schools are more segregated today than at any time since the 1960s. How can states and districts support improving school integration through school construction?
That's a great question, and they certainly segregated them through school construction. And I think that in RASA, with the ability to do planning and the requirement to have good data and have the communities engaged in planning with good data, that there will be a possibility to better plan to have integrated schools. But I would also like to caution that schools that are 100% minority, that are in poor condition, should be modernized. They should not have to wait to have white students in them before they are modernized. And part of what's happened in many of our urban center city communities is the disinvestment in those schools has pushed enrollments down so that they've been threatened with closing, and they've been closed rather than fixed up. And I think that we have to be careful about the frame on what it looks like, because I think that we really want to make sure that this gets the highest need kids. And then frankly, those schools will be more likely to be integrated. We saw that in Washington, D.C., where my kids were in school.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Malik, President Biden recently proposed a $25 billion investment to upgrade childcare facilities and build new supply of childcare, especially in high need areas. At the Center for American Progress, you have written extensively about childcare deserts. Can you please explain what childcare deserts are and how President Biden's plan would address the issue?
Yes, we were the first to collect the locations on all the licensed childcare programs in the US and found most census tracts, there were more than 3 times as many children as there were licensed childcare slots, which we dubbed childcare deserts. Those were disproportionately rural areas, low-income areas. And what we really need to think about when we're investing those infrastructure dollars is, how can we fill those gaps? How can we innovate to grow the childcare sector in its supply, to find those gaps and to serve those communities that have been underserved and have been left out?
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Filardo, thank you for your leadership at the 21st Century School Fund. As you already know, before I was a congressman, I was an educator in public schools for 20 years. I know firsthand that the infrastructure needs of our neighborhood schools run deep. The quality education we want for every child is only possible if we address the decades of disinvestment in our public schools, and specifically the learning environment we ask our students to learn in and our educators and school staff to work in. Incrementalism is a timeline we can't settle for. The President's American Jobs Plan calls for $50 billion in direct school infrastructure grants and $50 billion in bonds. RASA doubles this investment with $100 billion in grants. Can you explain why $50 billion in bonds would not provide as much support to low-income schools and how RASA will support the development of zero carbon schools?
Yeah, yes, I can. We were delighted to see school infrastructure in the president's plan, but actually quite disappointed in that the raising of the bonds and the lowering of the grants is really counter to any agenda for greater equity. Wealthy districts, or even basically middle income districts, can afford to borrow. They can get credit. They don't have to pay high interest rate because they have credit. The poor districts, they can't borrow. They don't go out to bond because there's no point. They've got no revenue stream to repay their debt with. So the lowering of the grant program in half was a real blow to low income, the lowest income districts, and really the highest need cities where they're already burdened with tremendous amount of debt. And I don't think people really realize, but local school districts are, I said it earlier in my testimony, about $500 billion in local school bond debt. And, it's not that they're not trying, they really are, but they need the federal help that RASA would give.
Can you explain how poor school districts became poor in the first place?
Well, there's a lot of different ways, right? But part of it is the average size of a school district in this country is 1,000 students. The median, I'm sorry, not the average, the median. And there's only, a handful of districts that are really large. The small districts in part are small, in part because of segregation. They were carved out to be small, and they don't come necessarily with high tax base or much of any tax base, whether it's sales tax or property tax. And so they are struggling, and they will not have any capacity to do a comprehensive project without state and federal help. Obviously in the cities, you have a different situation where you've got the average age of your infrastructure at 60, 70 years old, like in Baltimore or Philadelphia. And it's just so big and so old and so expensive to work in these urban environments that they have had a very hard time meeting the level of needs that they need, as well as the challenges with the operating costs of operating very old infrastructure. So it's a very challenging thing, and I know this is new. Federal funding for school infrastructure is new. It's they did it in the Depression, but it's not been a program. But it's not that we can't solve this problem. We can, but we need this federal, state, and local partnership to do it. And RASA really lays a plan out.
Thank you. Mr. Lanter, between 2018 and 2028, the direct care workforce is projected to add more than 1.3 million new jobs. Home care will add nearly 1.1 million jobs in that period, which represents the largest growth of any job sector in the country, yet nearly a quarter of these workers still rely on public assistance due to low wages and poor benefits. What can we do as legislators to make sure that we are training enough care workers to meet the growing need, and how can we best ensure all care workers earn a living wage?
Yes, good question. Thanks, Congressman. We have to do better. We need to start by acknowledging that the term quality jobs takes on many forms. But in all matters, we need to strive to ensure that individuals have dignity in work and that they can provide for themselves and families. Sectors like the one you mentioned, and another one we've been talking about here today, early childhood education, are in demand. And the impact of these industries are enormous. In California, kidsdata.org reports that even though there are roughly 1 million childcare slots available, it's only 1/3 of the need. The cost to business is annually $1.8 billion in absenteeism and turnover among working parents. But there are things we can do, Congressman, to help these industries. First, we should fund the development and articulation of career pathways that start at entry and mid-range jobs in these industries like the ones we're discussing, and show how individuals can further their career and move into an occupation that pays better wages in that field, or into a related industry in a field nearby, a related industry, sorry. And secondly, fund the work of workforce intermediaries, organizations that have deep knowledge of the industries in question, They can work with employers to help provide better work environments. They can link education providers to workforce development. They can ensure wages are increased. And finally, they can connect partnerships together, resulting in models like apprenticeship programs. And this work can all be scaled by the funding in the America's Jobs Plan.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Sorry for going so far over.
Thank you. Our next member is the distinguished chair of the Budget Committee, gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses. It's been an interesting discussion. I think what I've come away from the last couple of hours is a pretty stark reminder of why it is difficult to find common ground. I mean, we have some very substantial differences here, not just about whether the federal government should be involved in financing education across our country, but also what the value of education is. And I've been astounded to hear statements, I think basically one from Mr. McCluskey, that diplomas are just pieces of paper. I don't know how many non-college graduates are in responsible positions at the Cato Institute. I suspect that virtually everyone there has a college degree, so there must be some value placed on that. I've heard comments about how early childhood education is not particularly effective. And these things represent, again, a stark difference in I won't necessarily say parties, but in the perspectives that we have in Congress. I'm particularly interested in early childhood education. We are now at a position in this country where, for the first time, the majority of children born in this country are not white. That means that, at least particularly on a predictable basis, a larger percentage of our children will be coming from households with fewer resources at lower income levels than that has historically been true. But they are the next generation or two generations from now, that they are our tax force, they are our workforce. And I think this has to be a major national priority. And I heard comments like studies show that a young child is better off developmentally with a parent. Well, that may be true. It may be true in a majority of cases. I don't know. I know it is not true for everyone. I know it is unrealistic because a huge number of our children are not in households where the parent can spend all of his or her, mostly her, time with the child. And so I just keep asking where the answer is. I know what a former Republican president said. That was George W. Bush, who said, we can't afford to allow children to be deprived of the education they deserve because they're in a state or a locality that doesn't want to make the efforts to provide the quality of education for them. And I think that's a truism. I think it remains as true today, if not more true than it was almost 20 years ago. But again, I'm focused on early childhood education. And we have I represent Louisville, Kentucky. You could say Happy Derby Week to me, but we have an institution here called the Keystone Academy. It's an early childhood development center. It sits in the middle of housing projects. Every child in that facility is a Black or brown child, and again, coming from lower income households. And they use something called the Reggio method, in which the creativity of the kids determines what they do. The teachers are there to facilitate their wishes. I visited there and I was blown away. It was miraculous. These kids have such superior socialization skills, verbal skills. They are doing things that I could not believe 2- and 3-year-olds could do. And it seems to me that when you have that unlimited potential and the reality of the situation that we have literally tens of millions of kids in that position, that we at the federal level would not want to do something about that. So I fully support those provisions in the American Families Plan, and we'll work very hard to see that that's done. I have one quick question I'd like to ask of Mr. Malik, and maybe somebody else would want to respond to it. And that is, the one thing I worry about, if we provide these enormous benefits to a lot of people, whether it's free community college for 2 years or childcare, are we going to have a resourcing problem, and how are we going to handle that resourcing problem? Because you make a promise to American children that they're going to have access to full quality or high quality childcare. Are we going to be able to provide that?
Thank you, Congressman. I fully agree that this is a big project before us. I think the encouraging thing is we're finally talking about the kinds of investments that can get us to scale. Now, it will take several years, and we will need to prioritize certain regions, certain geographies, certain categories of families and children as we move up to scale. Because currently, right now, we've got a system that is working for the rich and the upper middle class. They can keep paying, and that's going to be annoying for them to keep paying until they get in. But that is, I think, doable, and that is the reason that we have the Child Care for Working Families Act scaled to the degree that it is.
Thank you for that. Thanks again to all the witnesses, and yield back.
Thank you. Has any member not been recognized for questions? I don't see anybody. If not, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, starting with Ms. Falardo. You had indicated the problem as about 50 billion per year. Is that what we are under investing in school school construction?
It's close.
And you've talked about the problem state and local governments have in coming up with the money, particularly in low-income areas. Can you say a word about why it's so important to use the Title I formula for distribution of the money, so it will actually go to low-income areas where it's most needed?
Yes, I mean, it's absolutely critical that it's targeted, because essentially what RASA would do, even at 100 billion, it's about not even 10% of the need nationally for what we should be spending on our school facilities, right? So the 100 billion, the 50 billion is what we're not doing, is the gap, right? Roughly, right? So if you've got 10 billion a year to spend out of RASA over 10 years, you have to target it in order to get to the poorest kids. I mean, it's just not going to happen any other way. And you know, we know that the politics of even states getting their dollars to the highest need is very tough. It's very hard. You know, it's not easy choices when there's not enough money around. And so this is so important to get it to poor communities.
Thank you. Mr. Riddle, you indicated that there's problem in getting people to work if they're getting unemployment. You're aware that if you've been offered a job, you're not entitled to unemployment. Is that right?
That is technically what the law has said, although that was relaxed during the pandemic. That has not been fully enforced by states during the pandemic.
But that's the rule. If you're offered a job, you're not entitled to unemployment compensation.
That is not always the case. If you can make a reason why, whether they're related to the pandemic or childcare or anything like that, you're not required to take the job. In some instances, on paper, you are. That has not necessarily been enforced, however, for the past year.
Okay. Well, the rule is if the employer offers you your job back and you refuse it, you'll just submit that to the Employment Commission, and you will lose your unemployment benefits, not just the $400, but the whole thing. Are you aware that you talked about the deficit that's grown over the years? You're aware that every Republican president since Nixon has left office with a worse deficit situation as a percentage of GDP than they inherited, and every Democratic administration has left with a better deficit situation than they inherited. You're aware of that?
Yes, but those statistics can be used misleadingly. For instance, President Bush had a housing crash happen at the end of his presidency. President Trump had a pandemic happen at the end of his presidency.
Whoa. He was on track to have a worse deficit before the pandemic. You're aware of that. So you're aware of the trend. And you've also talked about the devastating impact on the deficit that this spending would have. Are you aware that there are taxes associated to pay for these programs? So totally pay for the program within 15 years?
These programs are
not aware of that?
These programs are not paid for. In fact, the current one would only counts 8 years of spending and takes 15 years of taxes, even though the spending programs would likely continue after 8 years. The Congressional Budget Office is going to show that the taxes do not pay for these programs. The proposal released today as well as also will be scored by CBO as likely being about $1 trillion short.
In the 10-year window, but in 15 years, it'll pay.
But the spending that only assumes the spending stops, or unless the long-term care expansion is actually going to end after 8 years, which I do not believe is Congress's intention. The costs will continue, and the deficits will rise. That's why a lot of the long-term studies, such as Penn Wharton, have shown higher debt, lower wages, and lower GDP.
I'll go back to the fact that every Democrat since Kennedy has ended up with a better deficit situation than they inherited. Mr.
That's
Lynch,
not based on policies, however.
Well, just a coincidence. Mr. Lanton, in terms of apprenticeships, you didn't mention healthcare, insurance, or technology. Is there, can we fashion apprenticeships to cover these untraditional apprenticeship opportunities?
Absolutely, Chairman. In fact, there are already apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeships in those industries, including the insurance industry in our country, and they're modeled off of apprenticeship programs in the European Union.
Good, thank you. And I see my time has expired, so I want to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today. I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So that would be the close of business, May 12th, 2021, preferably in Microsoft Word format. Materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages may be incorporated to the record by way of an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time, but recognize that in future, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record should be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to ed&labor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Members are encouraged to submit materials to the inbox before the hearing or during the hearing at the time the member makes the request. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your participation. Members of the committee may have additional questions for you that we may ask witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. Now, I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to the committee practice, witness questions for the hearings must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days, and the questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. The ranking member has indicated that she does not have a closing statement. So I just want to thank the witnesses for joining us today and for sharing their expertise with the committee. Today's hearing made clear that the proposals in the American Jobs Plan do not just provide immediate COVID-19 relief for our communities, they also make long-term investments to address the lasting consequences of the pandemic and improve the quality of life across the country. Investments will help millions of displaced workers get the skills they need to find good paying jobs. They'll ensure that students and staff can safely return to the classrooms. They'll ensure that working families can afford safe and high quality childcare, and they will expand access to the lasting benefits of high quality higher education. Importantly, today's hearing also established the urgency of these proposals. Nearly all of the consequences of the pandemic are exacerbating disparities that have existed far longer than COVID-19. Unless we proactively invest in eliminating these disparities, our recovery effort could just bring us back to the status quo that failed too many Americans even before the pandemic. That proactive investment is what we mean when we say build back better. So again, I want to thank our witnesses for their time today, and as we swiftly consider this legislative plan, I want to hope we can put aside our differences and work to build a stronger and more equitable future for all of the people in our country. And if there's no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you again to all of our witnesses.